大家好，这是北美流氓，感谢回到我的频道。今天是2021年的5月11日，是一个星期二。那咱们来继续解读华尔街。那首先来看一下美国的几个指数，标普500今天跌了 0.87%， 道琼斯跌了 1.36%。纳斯达克跌了 0.09%， 纳斯达克100跌了 0.06%。今天虽然说三个指数都收低了，但我们看出了什么？看出了今天进入科技的钱相比进入能源啊、材料啊、这些周期性的板块的钱要多一些，好不好？所以纳斯达克也是跌的比较少。看一下11个标普板块，涨的只有一个板块，其他10个都在跌。涨的这个是材料啊，涨了 0.35%。跌的最凶的是能源，今天能源跌了 2.56%， 金融跌了 1.67%。这个工业跌了 1.44%， 这些都是比较周期的板块，今天是领跌。公共事业跌了 1.19%， 这是防御型板块，房地产也跌了 1.11%， 好吧。然后这个医疗防御板块也跌了将近1%啊， 0.98%。今天跌的最少的两个板块反而是科技板块，好吧。IT 这个科技跌了 0.26%， 通讯服务跌了 0.53%， 好不好啊？稍微有一点反着来啊，今天。那我们看一下11个标普板块，自从今年就是在股票资金开始流动的这个时间到现在的一个变化。那左边现在是调到了今年的2月18号，好吧。你看涨得最好的几个板块，就上面这个是材料，然后绿色这个是能源，紫色的这个是金融，然后褐色的这个是工业，好吧。这是领涨的4个板块。然后这个黑色的这个是科技啊，标普的科技板块，红色的这个是可选择消费品，好吧。这两个是领跌啊，自从今年2月中以来。然后看一下我们这个10年国债收益率啊，今天是 1.622个百分比，我感觉现在这个位置是被夹在这个三角形里啊，我觉得应该会突破啊，我觉得在未来的几个月，反正是在今年年前，这个10年国债收益率很有可能达到2%啊，2%，所以在这么一个过程中，我觉得成长股会继续不断的承压。那等这个10年美债收益率真正达到2%，咱们再看，好吧？我觉得那个时候有可能资金就会再大量的流回到这些成长股、科技股当中，从这些周期板块，好吧，这个还要继续去看啊。这是标普500日 K， 标普500在收盘的时候收了一个十字星，很棒一个十字星，但价格是跌到了这个蓝色的20日均线下。但我们看下面粉色的恐慌指数今天涨得很高，那当然相比什么时候高？相比这两个高度比较高，好吧？相比之前还算是比较低的一个位置，好吧？但是当这种恐慌指数和价格产生背离，同时出现了一个短期区间的一个突破的时候，我就喜欢加仓，好吧，我就喜欢反着来。当大家恐慌的时候，我就开始加仓啊。如果它再跌，当然这个再跌一波很有可能，因为如果看历史上这些指数，经常它不可能是只是一个 V 字形就上来，好吧，经常一个 V 再一个 small 跳，再往下降一下，一般是降2波啊，这是第一波的降。后面如果再来第2波降，我再加啊。如果它不降，就这样了，好不好？那我加仓也不是说把我所有现金都在这一个点加进去，好吧？我一直是保持着一定量的这个现金，好吧？那标普500现在的 2SI 啊，今天一下跌到 52.0114 了，好不好？跌的比较低了，已经快到中间的位置了。来看纳斯达克100啊，纳斯达克100的这个盘前期货是跌了 1%啊，最后它这一根大阳柱又收回来了，好不好？啊，最后还是收跌了，但是收跌了一点点。那我其实有考虑，我要不要当时来加仓这个纳斯达克100？虽然你看它跌的肯定是比标普500凶，好吧？但是目前我对科技股还是一个比较谨慎的一个状态，因为你要知道，那个标普500它里面已经有30-40%的科技股了，好吧？30%。将近30%的这个科技和10%几的 communications 啊，这个通信里面的大头也都是科技股，好吧？所以40%的科技股已经在标普500里了，所以我觉得就没有必要再对于我个人来说，就再去加仓这个很重仓科技股这个纳斯达克100，好吧？但是当然长线来看，我非常看好科技，只是这个中间这一波很痛苦，好吧？那如果未来标普500再来第2波下跌，好吧，一个 small 跳再下跌，跌到更深那个位置，我就可能再去考虑加仓什么呢？加仓这个金融啊，我现在非常看好金融，我在等这个10年美债收益率上去的这个过程中，我觉得金融还会继续受益。来看一下今天这个标普500的热力图啊，今天这个半导体感觉整体是绿的，好不好？整体是绿的，然后微软和苹果都跌了不到1%啊，苹果跌的比较多，0.74%。通讯服务里面Facebook 是绿的，但绿了一点点，0.18%。谷歌跌了1%，迪士尼跌了1.43%，奈飞涨了1.72%。再回到科技里面看这个软件啊，软件这一片也很绿。然后这个可选的消费品的那个亚马逊涨了1.05%，特斯拉又跌了1.88%啊。Home Depot 还跌了3.07%，Low 跌了2.83%啊，这些都是装修的公司，好吧？ 然后饭店今天也跌了 ，travel 旅游也跌了，今天有一点反着来的意思。然后金融里面这个 Amex、American Express 美国运通跌了2.68%，JP Morgan 大摩跌了1.66%，伯克希尔哈萨维跌了2.29%。这里面今天做保险的这一片全部是红的，好不好？然后今天做银行的也全是红的，反而这些和软件比较沾边的大头都偏绿。你看这边这个 PayPal，贝宝涨了2.04%，好吧？然后你看今天这些比较周期性的这些板块啊，你看这个能源特别的红，医疗保健也特别的红。那来今天的解读华尔街啊，左边请来了这个 Lisa 美国银行的，右边请来了 Steve 来自 Tech Advisor 啊，听听他今天的采访怎么说。开始。
More in the markets, I'm joined by Lisa Erickson, Senior Vice President and Head of the Traditional Investment Group at U.S. Bank, and Steve Milanovic, Managing Partner at Tech Advisor. Good to have you both. Steve, I'll start off with you since we are seeing this massive reversal in the tech sell-off that we had witnessed earlier today. Going to the point that Bob was making, that there is a haircut of about 30% on some of the highest flying stocks out there, the cloud stocks, et cetera. Is that a point in your view where you can go in and say that the price accurately reflects the fundamentals of these companies?
Yeah, Melissa, I would say it's still a little bit early. Just one example, about 20% of the NASDAQ stocks are at a one-month low. Typically, you want to see that closer to 35% to reflect capitulation.
主持人问他说，一些科技股已经跌了30%了，你觉得他们现在的估值是不是比较公平啊 ？Steve 说，现在纳斯达克里面20%的股票。目前的价位是他们一个月中的最低价位。他认为，当这个数达到35%的时候，也就是35%的纳斯达克成员股，它的价位都变成他们一个月最低的时候，才能说，整个纳斯达克这个指数是比较公平的价值。所以他觉得现在还有向下走的这个可能性或者空间。
So I don't think you have to be buying here. Large cap should hold up better, but remember, large cap stocks, for example, the XLK, has actually performed in line with the market the last 12 months. It's underperformed the last 6 as you had the rotation away from growth. Longer term, I still feel very good about names like Apple and Google and Microsoft. So if you're a long-term investor, you can probably pick away a little bit here, but it wouldn't shock me if there's a little bit more downside.
Yeah, are you
觉得很有可能还会向下。
surprised at the tech action, Steve, today, given interest rates ticked a little bit higher in today's session? We saw that massive, swing from down 2+% on the NASDAQ to basically flatline right now.
I'm a bit surprised. I'm not sure how much I'd read into it. I think, we could see further weakness. The IGV, which is the software index, yesterday closed right on its 200 days. So it is bouncing above that. We'll see if it holds there. I'd be a little bit surprised, actually, if it does. I was quite surprised last year when we kept talking about the most expensive tech stocks, mostly software names that are bouncing today, were the ones that just kept going up and up and up. And at some point, it didn't seem to make sense. So we're finally seeing the other side of that.
Yeah, Lisa, what's your take on the valuation of some of these cloud stocks, some of the software stocks, the ones that were really in the crosshairs when interest rates go up and investors start questioning valuations?
Well, absolutely. With the higher interest rates that we've had throughout year to date, as well as some pickup in inflation expectations, it is going to challenge some of these names where the growth is more forthcoming. But that being said, for tech as a whole, we feel very similarly to Steve that this is, if you look over the long term, a great sector to be a part of. There's certainly secular demands for continued usage of technology in many different formats. And so they are going to have some higher prices overall. And again, looking at the pullback we've had, it is an opportunity to, bring back some of those valuations to more reasonable levels.
长线他也是非常，两个人都非常看好科技，好吧？我也很看好科技，肯定科技改变命运，对吧？但是问题是现在就是需要这么一个估值的纠正，现在咱们正在进行一个成长股估值的纠正。
Lisa, this is Courtney Reagan here. We haven't really talked about yet the chip shortage and how that impacts a number of stocks, not just in the tech space, of course, but across the board. If that continues, what companies might win if you've got demand outstripping supply?
Well, in general, we do see just a broad array of basket of technology stocks, including suppliers, essentially, as well as those who offer in-services as attractive. And again, if we just look at what's going on with demand, what we see is there was already a trend towards really becoming a more digital economy overall. And really what happened in the pandemic, as we all know, is those trends just truly accelerated. And so that provides a very solid base, again, to hold a broad basket of stocks. And so we really are advocating staying put in those positions and, again, having a nice, healthy mix of stocks across the sector.
主持人问他说：“现在这个芯片荒你怎么看芯片？问他会选哪个个股啊？ 这个 Lisa 说她会选择 ETF 啊，她会选择拿一篮子的股票，好不好？那里面讲的就是 SMH 还有 SOX。SOXX 这两只 ETF， 好吧。
You know, Steve, in terms of this rotation that we've seen more broadly in the markets from growth to value, we're also seeing that within technology. You know, names like IBM, Cisco, Oracle, they are doing well relative to some of the other higher flyer names in the tech sector. Do you like any of those sort of quote unquote value tech, old school tech names?
Yeah, they have been doing quite well, and they are very much represented by, quote, value tech. These are the names I used to cover. So Dell, I know when I covered Dell, it's like, boy, this thing is really cheap. And now they've spun off VMware, and it's finally, you know, moving toward that kind of $100 price point. IBM, you mentioned. Arvind Krishna is doing some interesting work there, and even IBM's picking up. The HPs have acted well, though they're getting hit a little bit today. So today it's reversing. Legacy tech is down a bit, but you are seeing on-prem spending come back. So they're kind of the way to play tech on the opening because people are starting to spend on-premise computing. At the same time, the cloud spending still looks strong. It's not like you're seeing tech companies missing earnings generally. I just think there's a bit of a PE contraction, rotation away, higher interest rates, and it just has to play out a bit longer.
主持人问他说：“你对这些老牌的科技股有什么看法？比如说甲骨文呐、Dell 啊、思科呀这种股票，好不好？他也说他觉得很强，好吧？因为现在这个经济重启，说明什么？很多人要回去downtown的这个办公室上班，你要买思科的这些 switches、router 啊，这些做网络的这些器械，好吧？然后你要买电脑等等，对吧？那就对这些老牌的这个科技股可能有好处，但他觉得新派的科技股也不错，好吧？咱们看到这云端的东西也不差。”啊，只是说现在这些云端的东西需要一个重新的估值。
All right, good to get your insights. Thank you both, Lisa Erickson and Steve Milanovic.
来看一下今天这个 Jim 来自 Luthold Group 啊，这个人怎么说
Joining us now is Jim Paulson, Chief Investment Strategist at the Luthold Group, and I guess that's the perfect way to segue into this particular conversation, which is going to kick off with: does this market sell-off have any merits to buying?
You know, I think what we're dealing with, I agree with the rotational concept idea. I think it's been going on throughout this bull market. It is accelerating more towards economically sensitive areas, Dom. But I think what we're entering into here is what I call reval time. In every bull market going back to the 1980s, the market, when it first takes off, is stock prices go straight north and earnings keep going straight south. A lot of times for the first year of the bull. That's exactly what happened here. And the problem with that is ultimately if prices go north while earnings go south, the valuation metrics become very extreme, and it sets up for the need to revalue the stock market. I think that's what we're entering into right now. And the reval is a good thing for the longevity of the bull. I think what we're going to do is cheapen this market through the end of this year. Most of that will come through better earnings rather than falling prices, and then set up a much better valuation going forward. Just to give you an idea, we had a reval in 83, 84, 93, 94, 2004, 05, and 2009, 10. And it starts when the earnings start to improve, which just happened in the first quarter, and when bond yields start to move higher. And we're right in that same mode right now. But in the previous ones, in the 1980s bull, the reval resulted in a 35% drop in the PE multiple while it went on, even though the market was flat for that year when it got 35% cheaper relative to earnings. In the early 90s bull, multiples went from 27 on trailing earnings to 17 over that same period of time. And in the early 2000s, it went from 22 to 17. And in 09, 010, it went from 26 to 16. I think, you know, we were over 30 times earnings, Dom, earlier when this bull market, just not that long ago. I think as we go into next year, we might have a trailing multiple that's like 18 and a half times earnings and looking much more attractively priced. So I think we're going to continue to have volatility. We could have a correction yet this year, but I think it's a buy yet going into next year.
All right, it's a buy. So how?
主持人问他怎么看现在这个股市啊？他觉得咱们现在进入了一个重新估值的区间或者期间啊，因为他也是列出了之前所有的或者很多的这个历史上的这个同样的行为。当我们进入一个新的牛市的时候，我们第一年都会有一个非常急速向上涨的一个情况，然后进行一个重新估值啊。他以前也举出了很多以前的例子。那他认为去年这个疫情来，这个黑天鹅就是咱们一个新牛市的开始，但是和历史上一样，第一年就是去年的时候。 候，当这些公司做的都不好的时候，反而股价向上走，导致咱们的估值非常的高，非常的滑稽所以现在咱们来到一个重新估值的区间，这是让咱们整个这个市场的 PE， 那这里讲的是标普500的 PE 在整体向下走一走但是整体向下走一定说明咱们的股市今年会跌吗？不一定，有可能是横盘1年进行一个消化，但别忘了今年美国 GDP 将成长8%还是7%，反正很高，好不好？今年美国 GDP 有这么强的一个成长，这些公司的每股收益会赶上来，在这一年。然后如果股市不动的话，再进行消化的话，那咱们这个美股就看起来非常的有趣了，好不好？就估值就没那么大了，没那么多泡沫了，好吧
？How much do interest rates matter? If this is a revaluation, oftentimes that revaluation is driven because of valuation concerns, and those valuation concerns are driven by higher interest rates. So if the interest rate trajectory is holding where it is right now, does the revaluation need to happen?
I think it will, yeah. I think that we're having escalated fears about inflation. I think our growth rate this year is going to be like 8.5% real GDP, something in that ballpark. Globally, it might be the strongest growth year recorded. And I think it's going to continue to escalate inflation fears. And I still think bond yields, Dom, are going to end up above 2% yet before the year's out. So there'll be continued pressure on that, keeping stock prices, I think, in a trading range. But the good news is earnings, I think, are going to be spectacular. I personally believe we're going to have like $215 S&P 500 earnings by the end of this year. And, you know, the first quarter, the annualized run rate on those first quarter earnings are close to $200 annualized share rate. So if we're already at $200 run rate, maybe 215 is not high enough. If we end the year at 4,000-ish on a $215 earnings, you know, we're going to have a very attractively priced market going into next year. Even if rates are 2.5%, that's still some of the lowest rates in U.S. history with a below average PE multiple and another year of pretty good growth.
All right, so
他觉得这个，因为今年美国 GDP， 他说预期成长今年涨8.5%，所以这个他觉得10年美债收益率肯定会到2%，好吧，一定会到2%。然后说，如果咱们今年标普500收在4000点，就是咱们现在已经到4000点了，就收在这个位置，就是不动那到2022年的话，就看起来是非常的有趣了，好吧？这估值就非常的就比较偏向公平了。好不好？那当然，如果咱们现在都到了4000多了，他说收在4000，那说明什么？今天可能要么横盘，要么就是横向震荡应该会比较颠簸
So then, Jim, if that's the case, if there is constructiveness to be had in the market right now, there are certain places that are better values than others. What exactly are those particular sectors given that interest rate profile and the profile for earnings growth going forward?
You know, I just looked back at this, Dom, at the 4 previous reval periods that had interest rate and inflation pressures embedded in them. And what I found was you think you might want to move to defensive stocks, but where you want to move is to tie yourself to the cyclicality of the economy. The best performing groups historically have been cyclical stocks, cyclical sectors, and small cap stocks. And
他说经济重启的时候，你以为你比较颠簸，你以为你要买这些比较防御型的股票，但他认为从最近4次的这个重新估值区间发生的时候，应该去买这个周期性板块，就和很多其他华尔街的人说的一样，好吧？现在就说继续保持着一个周期性板块的这么一个持有。
And I think that's where you want to stay weighted.
他还说这个小板块罗索2000那种的，好吧？我不是很喜欢罗索2000，好吧？那个东西震荡太大。
In the rest of this year, small caps have just been revalued very nicely, and I think Alpha and I buy point. Cyclicals have continued to just plow ahead, but I think they might continue to do that in the rest of this year as well. Now, there could be a trade as we get closer to year end, and we know the growth rate's going to slow down next year. It might be a time at that point to trade out of cyclicals and smalls, and quite frankly, I think it might be time at that point to go back into technology again for 2022.
All right, a resurgence of technology possibly. Jim Paulson at the Luthold Group, thank you so much. Great.
他说明年2022年我们知道成长会降低，什么成长？我们讲的是美国经济成长 ，GDP 成长会降低，会缓慢。在 GDP 开始缓慢的时候，当经济开始缓慢的时候，周期股就没有那么有趣了，华尔街也许就不那么待见周期股了，但这是明年的时候，所以他现在认为到明年的时候，咱们要开始缓慢的时候，开始把钱再从周期股拿回到成长股和科技股，或者是加仓成长股和科技股那好，来看今天这个汤姆里汤姆里也是被采访了。汤姆里 Fund Strat 这个人是出了名的怼 Fang 特别不喜欢 Fang。 这不是说他长线不喜欢翻译，是他现在对这个经济环境他不喜欢翻译。他昨天也是发推特出来这个抬杠这个翻译，好不好？这一大科技股啊，听一下。
Later, we are going to get to all of this with our first guest this hour. Just downgraded tech to neutral recently, and this morning says the tech stocks could decline an additional 7%, would take you down to that 200-day moving average level. Tom Lee of Fundstrat joins us this morning. Tom, it's always a treat and great to see you again.
Yeah, great to see Carl and crew.
You've been pretty stubborn and resolute about sticking with what you call epicenter names or cyclical names that are exposed to the recovery. What makes you think there's more downside on the tech side?
Carl, I think that there have been 5 headwinds for tech that feel like they're coming to a head. In fact, I think Stan Druckenmiller in his interview today really spoke to it, that one of the overarching problems with tech starting this year is it's a crowded and stale long. People piled into these names last year because of the collapse of the economy and the pandemic. But now we have potential inflation building, interest rates going up. The White House could go after technology. The U.S. economy, not everyone believes it, but it looks like we're set for a full reopen by June. And then capital gains could go up. 5 of these is bad.
他说利率大家害怕要走高，通胀大家害怕要走高，白宫现在又不太喜欢科技，然后那个加税收的问题也会对科技有很差的影响，所以他认为这些都是科技现在面临的这些逆风，现在科技是逆风而行，所以他不喜欢科技，他觉得科技会跌7%，就是纳斯达克会再跌7%，达到200日均线的这个位置。
For the technology and growth trade, especially capital gains. More than 70 or 80% of all capital gains are just in a handful of sectors. And on the other hand, the epicenter trade wins on 5 of these. So if only 1 or 2 of these flips, in fact, happens, epicenter stocks are going to keep rallying and tech can weaken. So I think the move to the 200 days is probably the first reasonable stop to say, can we take a look to see if there's bargains? And that's, 7% downside.
Right. And then you go a step further, Tom, and you talk about, you're citing Nomura's quant team, that if you did get back to that level, you could be looking at what they called a crash up into cyclicals, where I guess the thinking is what? You get a new team of people who say, I want in on that?
Yes. I mean, I'm going to speak a little anecdotally, but in our conversations with institutional investors, they built their entire careers for the past 10 years, even 12 or 15 years, buying growth stocks and earnings beats. They've survived by ignoring cyclical stocks. In fact, that's the reason they kept their jobs. But the environment in 2021 is so different. It is the diametric opposite of the last 12 years. And investors are reluctant to actually have any exposure. I mean, this is what we find in conversation after conversation. They say something like, why should I buy energy? It's only 3% of the S&P. Apple's bigger. I got to get Apple right. I don't care about energy. But for the first time, maybe, since we've been recommending Epicenter, last week we got finally some investors to take a look at these cyclicals. So I think it's just the door has finally opened. We're probably in stage 0 out of stage 30.
他说他也和很多机构的人聊，那些机构的人最近的10几年全都是在炒科技股起家，但是今年还是要开始去对这个周期股进行曝光。虽然他们以前都无视周期股，说你已经有苹果这么好的公司，谁想买石油股，谁想买跟原油有关的公司？但今年不一样，他说今年这个经济环境不一样，一定要有一定的曝光对这些周期的板块，好吧？
So Tom, if there's more downside for tech, and you want to sort of get in on it as an opportunity, what areas are you looking at? We made the distinction between mega cap and cloud stocks and some of the more momentum names over the last few years. What would you be looking at?
I think in tech, I guess you're asking about tech, Deirdre. And what we said is tech is really 40% of the S&P. We would want to only own half of that. So 20% should be someone's weighting in tech. So you still want to have some exposure. There's real shortages in semiconductors and the supply chain, and we know that's why there's real commodity inflation. So semi-cap equipment makes a ton of sense because you're going to be moving the supply chain to America. And I think any company that can actually ease inflationary pressures, and that's a lot of technology companies, are actually going to capture a lot of value. So I think anybody who works on the supply chain or helps contain inflationary costs are going to be the safe places in tech. And we identify.
他在顶 SMH， 他在顶半导体行业，好吧，在顶半导体行业。还有就是说，他认为如果就是标普500来看，他觉得里面的科技太多了。标普500里面的科技股，他说有40%，好吧。那当然，它是包括了这个 IT 这个行业和这个 Comms 这个通信服务的行业里面都有很多的 这个科技，好吧？这2个板块里面，科技里面有40%。他说他觉得这个太多了，对他来说，他只能接受20%，在他的这个投资组合里面。现在来看，好吧。
Identified 3 or 4 industries in our report Sunday that look decent in tech, but to me, the layup. I mean, those are battleground. That's a battleground sector, as one of our clients in Connecticut says. I'd rather be buying energy here because oil is already making a decisive movement. Energy has a huge catch up to that, especially things like oilfield services, which is OIH.
但是相对于就算这种比较公平的这种科技股，他还是更喜欢买石油股、能源股。
Tom, you're talking about what is safe in tech. Let's talk a little bit more about what might be smart in tech if you're looking to take on some risk. I mean, some of the volatility that we've seen, it's been crazy, but was it really that hard to see coming? I was talking to another Tom, Tom Siebel, billionaire, co-founder, CEO of C3 AI, just a couple weeks ago about this kind of volatility he's seen after his IPO. Here's what he said.
But it just shot up like a skyrocket. I can't explain why that happened. I think at one point it was trading like at 100 times revenue. Well, you and I, John, know that companies don't trade at 100 times revenue in a sustained state. So we've seen, some of the air get let out of the stock since then, and but it's still trading, I think, 70% higher than when than where we priced it.
And he said that some of the air coming out for the overall market, a good thing. What do you have to believe, though, about these growth stocks in tech with trends like AI to buy them around here?
Well, I think for anyone who's patient, tech's a bargain here, right? Because it's already off its highs. And these companies are going to grow double digits. I don't think tech's growth rate slows at all in the next few years. It's just the risk premia collapsed, and that's made them expensive. But, our long-term view is tech will easily become at least 50% of the S&P, if not more. I mean, the U.S. stock market is essentially becoming a tech index. I don't think that's changed. I think that's going to be true 5 years from now. And labor shortage means technology companies capture more value because how else can you replace labor? But I think the challenge is really finding something that's not crowded and not picked over, but can positively surprise. So I think that's the challenge right now with the cloud names and a lot of the work from home. I think semiconductor and semi-cap equipment can still positively surprise because at the end of the day, if you're moving the supply chain to America, I mean, that's a huge amount of investment. And, it's actually really an opportunity for the U.S. to create innovation. So I think you're going to see a lot of cool things come out of tech still, especially like autonomous driving as well.
他还是很看好这个半导体的，如果尤其是现在要把这些工厂要往美国挪一挪，然后对美国进行一些投资，好吧，很看好这个行业。好，就是说他认为这些科技股，就是前面问他说你现在这些已经跌了很多的，这些已经腰斩的30%、50%跌的这种，你觉得是不是时间买？他说如果你是一个有耐心的人，也许现在就是一个时间买，好吧？只是一个最近这一段，因为经济周期现在不待见这个东西，所以它肯定会很震荡，或者是比较多的横盘，你能不能忍啊？但未来很看好科技啊，他也很看好科技，好吧？他说未来5年内啊，标普500 50%的比重将会是科技，现在是40%，啊，以后这些科技股就整个把这个美国股市给吃掉了，美国这几个指标，好不好？
Tom, you've done a lot of research ever since the beginning of COVID on the progression of the pandemic itself. I guess the question from me would be, to what degree are you building in a black swan, where could I be wrong scenario in which there's some variant that's resistant to the vaccines we have that would obviously send a lot of money flowing back into these names that is these stale longs, as Stan said, that where money is now seeping out?
Well, that's right on, Carl. I mean, COVID has proven anything to be super tenacious and unpredictable. I mean, in our daily commentary, we're terrified to actually make any forecasts. And where can this be taking place? I mean, at the end of the day, it's a virus that's mutating, and as it spreads, it keeps mutating, and we're seeing that super surge take place in India. So I would agree. I don't think it's a foregone conclusion that COVID is in retreat globally. And if India, if the surge lasts, that it causes the economy to shut down, as that's going to send a wave of panic across the global economies.
Yep, and we're hoping that's something we can.
主持人就问他说，如果再来一个这个黑天鹅的事件，好不好？就比如说疫情第2次或者第3次再次爆发，怎么办啊？会不会钱再回到科技啊？再回到成长股？他说他们这个公司就不敢去预测那个的到来，好吧？当然那个是有可能性的，这个是一个风险，对不对？那因为现在你看印度这个它在传播的过程中，这个病毒还在不停的变种，如果变到一个非常变态的种，现在咱们的疫苗没有用，那说不定 就给咱打到解放前了，好吧？打到去年年初的时候了，对不对？所以这是一个风险啊。好，来看一下这个 Eaton Vance 这个机构怎么说。
Continue that conversation with Lou Piantadosi, Eaton Vance Management Vice President and Co-Director of Growth Equity, joins us this morning. Lou, it's a good day to have you. Thank you for the time.
Good morning, Carl. Thanks for having me.
I was just looking at a note here from Morgan Stanley. They say that their unprofitable tech basket, and everybody's sort of got a version of that, has underperformed SPX by 42% over 3 months. And if you take out COVID last spring, it's the worst stretch in 10 years for any thematic basket. And they looked at over 100. I guess at this point, do you think that's getting a little tired?
I think that the sell-off is justified, given the meteoric rise that a lot of these stocks exhibited, particularly post the COVID initial stages of COVID. And, you know, given where we are right now, I mean, there's 4 real headwinds to most areas of tech, and namely the fear of higher rates, tougher comparisons going forward, particularly for those that have benefited from COVID. Corporate tax reform, which is something that isn't being discussed right now.
他说，现在这科技股的遇到的这些逆风啊，顶着头的这些风，和刚才那个汤姆里说的很像。
But it will have an impact on tech more so than other areas of the market. And then lastly, particularly for mega cap tech, I think, you know, we're seeing more and more antitrust headwinds starting to pick up as well. So all of those headwinds, you know, kind of come together at a time when there's other areas of the market that will benefit from a recovering economy that had been neglected by the market for the last few years, and now we're starting to see a real resurgence. So really no surprise here.
It does sound like you think there are areas within tech that are buyable on a pullback, and I think you're pointing to semis on that, versus others like payments and cloud, where maybe the high valuation means there is a little more downside to come.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think the semis are buyable right now. I think the stocks have come in, not as much as some of the others, but the valuation of those companies are much more attractive for kind of a good entry point in some of those names. I like the analog semis the best because they do have leverage to a recovery of the industrial economy. You know, areas like payments, AI, the cloud, still great long-term secular growth opportunities. But I don't think those names truly bottom out until investors can kind of figure out, well, where are rates going? Where is this inflationary environment we're in? Is that transitory or?
他说他现在很看好半导体，他觉得半导体现在是一个非常有趣的一个买入点，好吧？但是关于电子钱包啊，关于云端啊这些科技公司，他觉得现在还要等这个投资者真正看清楚这个通胀率的这个问题。通胀它到底是不是个暂时的？如果通胀不是暂时的，美联储加快速度缩紧的话，这些股票又继续受灾，好不好？
Is it going to be something that's longer lasting? And if it is in fact transitory, and you know rates go to 10-year goes to 2% and change, you know those stocks will be close to bottoming out here. But if it's something more difficult than that, then we might have a little bit more to go before those do bottom out.
他说，如果这个通胀是暂时的，在这种情况下，等10年美债收益率达到2%的时候，他觉得科技股这些云端啊、电子钱包这种科技股就到底了，好吧？如果这次通胀不是暂时的，是个持续的，那这个还会再往下走啊。
Lou, it's Morgan. Just in terms of being able to gauge a bottom, or I guess factor in some of the signals that might indicate we're there, is this just a matter of giving time when you talk about the possible transitory nature of the situation, or are there certain actual things that you're looking for right now?
Yeah, I think for us, the biggest things on a fundamental basis is we're likely to see a real deceleration of growth in a lot of those names, particularly the ones that did benefit from the COVID shutdown. And, you know, in the growth stock world, nobody likes to see a deceleration. But given that, you know, we had kind of where we borrowed some business from the future because of COVID, you know, we're going to see that natural deceleration. But the market still hasn't really come to grips with how much of a deceleration are we going to see. So I think once the bar gets reset, and I think it's coming in the next quarter or two, we'll get a better picture of what is truly the long-term sustainable growth rate for these names. And once the market gets comfortable with that, these names probably become investable again.
他现在讲的就是居家概念股。他说现在这个科技股里面有一些名字指的就是居家概念股，因为去年疫情的时候涨得很高，因为他们居家概念嘛。现在大家现在期待不居家概念了，现在要出去上班、出去吃饭、出去玩，经济重启。所以他现在大家对这些股票很害怕 ，Zoom Peloton， 很害怕这种名字。所以现在就说再等2个季度，等我们知道真正在经济重启的大环境中，他们的成长会不会缓慢？如果说他们没有缓慢，很好；如果他们缓慢下来了，缓慢多少？这个是投资者需要知道的。一旦知道了这个缓慢的这个数，在正常经济重启之后的这个数，他们这个表现才能继续对它进行一个估价。现在大家不敢对它估值，都不敢进这些股票，好不好？
So does that mean that at least for now, for the next couple quarters, value is the new momentum play?
Well, I mean, it has been for the last 3 or 4 months, right? And again, I think that's it's been a neglected area of the market for a long, long time. And, money goes where it's treated best. And right now it's being treated best in those stocks. And I think that, but at some point it does create an opportunity for long-term investors. And, I don't think we're exactly there yet. Like I said, I think the semis are certainly viable here. But for new money, I think there's a little bit more to go in some of these areas that are a little bit growthier and more expensive.
So does that mean, Lou, that if you get new money in, you're actually going to take the plunge into some names? I mean, how are you reallocating within the portfolio at this point, given the things that you're outlining?
Yeah, that's a good point. Like I said, we're certainly more inclined towards those levered to a rebounding economy. And like I said, the semis certainly qualify for that. We have a valuation sensitivity to everything we do. We're more of a GARP style than a momentum style. But again, we're looking at a lot of areas that have these secular growth characteristics that as they come into attractive prices, we're buying a little bit here, there, 10, 20 basis points. I mean, some of these names are down 40, 50, 60%. So to say that we're still early in the decline, I think would be disingenuous. I think there's probably a little bit more to go. And as you start to scale in bit by bit, not a bad strategy for the next few months.
I guess the question would be, Lou,
他也是非常看好这个半导体啊，非常看好这个半导体行业。
If you did get a further downdraft on some of those areas, whether or not it would make investors even more uncomfortable and crashing into so-called cyclical names, or whether there is still a mentality that price brings interest, brings bargains, and there would be a buy the dip mentality. It doesn't sound like you think that's dead.
Yeah, no, I don't. I mean, it's very hard to gauge where, kind of the momentum is or where the retail investor is going to go. We've seen a big correction in a lot of these retail favorites. And, I feel like that's kind of the point of we've got to make a decision on these stocks. Do we want to stay with them, or is it a buy the dip mentality? And I think retail investors have been getting their hands slapped whenever they do try to buy the dip over the last few months. So, flows are difficult to gauge, but at the end of the day, we're looking at the fundamental value of the business and what we think it is relative to what the market's telling us. So if we're a little bit early, that's okay. If there's a little bit more downside that gets overdone, we're okay with that too. And that's why we kind of ease in along the way during some of these big time corrections. We wait for the market to come to our terms. And, when the market's fearful, that's typically the time when, you want to get a little bit more aggressive, right?
Yeah, well, anyone who's been around for the past 15 months can attest to that. Lou, that's a great gut check, especially on a more.
那这个人他说话也是很模糊啊，他没有说给出特别好，反正他比较确认的说他很喜欢半导体，觉得半导体现在是一个他主要喜欢这种 analog 半导体就是这种比较老派、比较低端的半导体的这种生产商因为这个和经济重启很有用，对吧？因为其实现在这些工业里面需要的半导体都是低端、中低端半导体，不是说高端服务器半导体，好不好？所以应该就是像这种德克萨斯仪器这种公司，好吧，出各种传感器这种东西。然后他说，关于现在这个回调要不要买，他觉得应该可能股价还会向下要走一点，不过他觉得如果他们的这个机构能找到一些好的名字、好的一些基本面，他会慢慢的开始往里买，慢慢往里买，好吧？那好，最后咱们来看一下这个瑞银这个人怎么看目前这个大宗商品价格暴涨的这个问题，好吧
？Look, I mean, with growth being strong and where you are seeing real rates close to their lows, there's a sort of an inconsistency. Inflation break-evens are extremely high. Real rates are extremely low. Yields should move higher slowly, but this mix should change. So commodity prices, we think, are close to peaking. Copper, certainly iron ore, and potentially also oil, we think are running hotter than fundamentals suggest.
他认为这些大宗商品已经要到顶端了，他可能提了铜， 他说还有可能石油也会到顶端了，这个价格。
Then the actual medium-term supply and demand situations in these markets suggest the fact that these curves are in backwardation tells you that there's a near-term shortage, not a medium-term shortage. That should come through into inflation expectations. So I would expect inflation expectations fall with commodity prices through the remaining 6 to 12 months or coming 6 to 12 months, and real yields increase. And that should mean that while this rotation that you folks were speaking about earlier in the program, away from growth towards value, has a little more to run, it's a trade, not an investment. We don't think the value trade is likely to prosper for very long. And within value, we would actually be moving away from things like materials and energy towards financials, which can actually withstand an increase in real interest rates a little bit better than materials and energy can.
他说，相比材料和这些矿工啊，还有这个能源这些板块，他更喜欢金融啊，更喜欢金融。他觉得未来6到12个月，这些大宗商品都应该去开始冷却啊这些价格。
And so, number one, the value trade is probably going to be around for another month or two at best. And number two, within that trade, we're already looking for financials rather than materials.
Banu, there's something going on here which I find very, very strange. Good morning to you, by the way. Nice to see you. Why are central banks so afraid of achieving their objective? Their objective is to hit 2% inflation. You say you believe it's going to be 1.6% core PCE same time next year as well. That means they would have failed to achieve their objective of hitting 2% if they're at 1.6%. Why are central banks so afraid? Is it because they know something that actually tech investors are beginning to realise, that actually if you hit these targets and if you exceed these targets on the inflation front on a non-transitory basis, then we've got a huge debt problem out there, which is going to explode many companies, countries, and individuals?
To be honest, I think central banks are worried about almost exactly the opposite thing, in that if I'm the Fed, for instance, me and my colleagues around the table are probably more worried about, in the medium term, about disinflation rather than inflation. I mean, consider what's happened in the last 3 years. US has been able to take down real interest rates by 200 basis points, Germany by about 20 basis points, and Japan by 0 basis points. And why is that? That's because in Japan and in Europe, you haven't been able to pick inflation expectations higher. So you want to be able to control inflation expectations. You haven't been able to take real interest rates lower. So for all the easing from the BOJ, for all the PEPP from the ECB, for all the APP from the ECB, you haven't been able to bring down the price, the real price of money. Now, this is a situation where, we could be nickeling and diming here, but the bigger picture could be that we are at the bottom of the end of a 35-year process of real interest rates declining. Real interest rates stopped declining in Japan about a decade back, in Europe about 5 years back. And it's possible that we're at the end of that process in the US as well. Real interest rates can't go down. So you want to be able to push up inflation expectations. So in the future, you can take real interest rates lower. I think the bigger worry for central banks is that they won't, the next time an asteroid hits the Earth, they don't have the wherewithal to take real interest rates much lower, which is the one tool that they have. I think that's what they're worried about.
说得非常好，说得非常的好啊！主持人问他，你是不是觉得这个美联储现在害怕通胀？因为通胀之后他们要提前加息，加息的话会怎么样？加息的话，很多人会破产，很多公司会破产。那这个瑞银的这个人反而觉得美联储担心的是相反的事情，担心通货紧缩，所以这就是为什么他要鲍威尔说要达到一个长期以来的2%的一个平均通胀率，允许通胀走到3%，对不对？为啥呢？如果你通货紧缩了，就很危险了。说谁呢？说日本呢？你看，日本它进这个疫情来的时候，它是负的利率，当然这个时候经济都萎缩，对吧？大家不出门，人家这个央行都在拉闸，把这个利率往0的地方压。日本已经是负的了，它往哪压？它没有这个工具了，所以现在美联储不想让美国变成一个日本，对，不想让美国变成日本，所以说现在就允许你通胀走起来，正好趁机把咱们这个利率缓慢的再向上走，最起码走到2%。疫情来之前，美国的美国的利率是2%出头，所以咱们才有2%的利率可以压榨到0.25%，对不对？来刺激经济。如果假如说咱们通胀不来，咱们来一个通胀紧缩啊，反着通胀走。 美国的利率一直保持在0%到0.25%的时候，下一次，假如说咱们说5年后，那我不希望这个事情发生。咱们说5年后，如果发生了战争，或者是新一波的疫情，另一种病毒，美联储没有工具啊，没有改利率的工具了，已经到0.25%了，对不对？所以趁咱们这个 GDP 在涨的时候，趁咱们这在经济恢复的时候，让它通胀一些，然后美联储可以在未来几年慢慢再把利率调到多少？调到最起码2%以上，咱们只需要2%，最起码。那下一次黑天鹅来，咱们有这个 room 可以去调它，懂我的意思吗？那说到通胀，你可能说 QE 多简单，你就一直发钱，通胀就起来了。现在美国是这样，你一直发钱，一直放水 QE 是能起来，那是因为咱们现在还没有进行通货紧缩。如果通货紧缩真正开始了，好不好？就晚了 ，QE 就晚了。那你说怎么可能？为什么通货紧缩你放水就不会通货膨胀？你看一下日本嘛，日本从12年前利率就调到了0，调到了负的。那你说日本有没有 QE？ 日本不知道 QE， 日本 QE 了 ，QE 没有用，因为当你已经开始通货紧缩的时候，当大家已经开始预期明年他们的手里的钱会更值钱，能买更多的房子的时候，他们就不会花这个钱了。你把利率调成负了也没用，我也不买你的房子，房子就一直贬值呗。所以美联储一定要快速的来防止成为下一个日本，你们说是不是这个意思？日本一直在 QE 没有用，日本的利率还是负的，还是在通缩，对不对？所以我觉得这个瑞银这个人说的很好，好吧，这是BeiMeiLiuMang流氓，希望这期视频对你有所帮助。如果你是第一次看我视频，别忘记点赞、订阅、打开小铃铛。我们下次见，拜拜。